COP24 is the most important COP since the Paris Agreement. It is the most important because it is the place where the mechanisms for the implementation of the Paris Agreement are going to be agreed by all parties to the agreement. Informally, those mechanisms are referred to as the rule book, and the rule book refers to the conclusion of the Paris Agreement work program. This is where all parties are going to specify the commitments that they are going to be making for the implementation of the agreement, as well as the mechanisms that will be put in place to hold parties accountable for those commitments. For Africa, it is particularly important because it is coming now after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, published its report on the impacts of 1.5 degrees warming. And we all know from that report that already at 1 degree global warming, Africa is experiencing significant impacts from climate change. You can translate these impacts into impacts on economic development, for instance, and we could demonstrate that perhaps up to between 5 and 10% of Africa's GDP is already being diverted towards responding to the impacts of climate change, mostly in unplanned responses to extreme weather events. So it is really important for Africa that the Paris Agreement is implemented, and implemented very urgently, in order that we stay within the 1.5 degree warming target. So in order for Africa to express the urgency and the importance of these issues for our continent, there are quite a number of processes that are in place across the continent, where climate scientists, policymakers, researchers are engaging to look at what can be done by the continent itself in terms of putting in place mechanisms for responding to climate change. But there are also mechanisms and processes where African politicians, African policymakers, and African negotiators are engaging globally to ensure that the interests of the continent are reflected in the outcomes of the COP, and particularly in the structure of the rule book. As ACPC, we've been supporting some of these processes. We have in 2018 convened 2 continental processes to contribute to the political dialogue around the climate change. This informal political dialogue is referred to as the Talanoa dialogue. We had one meeting in Addis Ababa in March, and very recently we convened the Climate Change and Development Conference in Africa in Nairobi in October. And both of these meetings came up with very specific recommendations about what we think should be done in order to ensure that a comprehensive climate response is put in place, and that we safeguard the future of our planet. Some of these recommendations include the demand that there should be adequate finance for the climate response for developing countries, from developed countries, request that there should also be sufficient mechanisms put in place to ensure that technology is transferred to support the economies of developing countries, and also that there is sufficient capacity building. There are also recommendations that the rule book itself should ensure that mechanisms that are put in place for the implementation of the NDCs should include accountability and transparency mechanisms. We should have the opportunity to hold all countries accountable for their actions and the implications of their actions for climate. But also all those actions should also be transparent and made transparent through various reporting mechanisms, monitoring and verification mechanisms. And then of course there are a whole lot of technical issues that are being discussed regarding how we understand the impacts of climate change. By this we mean that, for instance, most of the discourse that you have refers to global averages and global impacts. So we understand that a global average temperature increase of 1.5 degrees is probably going to mean a 3 degrees warming on the African continent because of the geographic specificities of our continent. And therefore we need to plan for that eventuality should it happen. But we also need to ensure that the world is conscious of this fact, that while we are planning for a global average of 1.5, we need to understand that the impacts might be greater on the African continent than elsewhere, and that therefore the global agreement should reflect this reality. So these are some of the processes that are in place, and these are some of the expectations that we have of the outcomes of COP24.